Welcome to the Certitude of the Catholic Faith. I'm John Veneri, and as you know, this program is a program of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, on the structure given by Pope St. Pius X, the Catechism of Pope St. Pius X. And we have been talking about the Creed. Well, we've been within the framework of the first article of the Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty. And in the 4 previous programs, we talked about the one theory that is prominent in our day, that is the number one reason or excuse, or whatever you want to call it, for people not believing in the literal account of Genesis, and that is the theory of evolution. Now, in the previous program, as I said, we did 4 programs on this, so I'm not going to recap everything, but we demonstrated that evolution is not really tenable because of the lack of fossil evidence. The fossil evidence isn't there. And we did quote the great Catholic journalist and writer Malcolm Muggeridge. He said, "I am convinced that the theory of evolution, especially the extent to which it's been applied, will be one of the great jokes in the history books of the future. Posterity will marvel that so flimsy and dubious a hypothesis could be accepted with the incredible credulity that it has." So that's Malcolm Muggeridge on evolution. We quoted scientists before who would admit grudgingly the lack of fossil evidence for the theory of evolution. But I want to move on to the next phase of this. We're going to be closing this topic out in the next 2 programs, this one and the next one. And we're going to talk about the Catholic Churchmen's response to evolution in the 20th century. And I say this with due respect to people who are, who hold positions of authority. I believe that the Church's response, the Churchmen's response to evolution in the 20th century was a weak one, but there are reasons for that. So we'll get to the topic at hand. How did the Church respond? I should say, how did Churchmen respond? In his 1967 book, Original Sin in the Light of Present-Day Science, in fact, I might have that date wrong. I actually think it was 1961. Anyway, 67, 61, 6 years difference. A priest named Father Patrick O'Connell, he lamented the widespread acceptance of evolution by so many of his fellow priests. He spoke of clergymen in his day, and I'm quoting him, who have fallen victim to, quote, the intense propaganda inside the Church for the theory of evolution over the past half-century. Now, as is evidence, if you would consult a pre-1960 religious text or book of theology, evolutionism was alive and well inside the Church during the entire pre-Vatican II period. The teaching contained in these texts, loudly repeated today, is the claim that Catholics may believe in evolution, provided 2 things. Number 1, provided that we believe that God is the creative force behind it all. It's not just operating on our own. Evolution, they claim, is part of God's creative process. And secondly, that we may believe in evolution of the body, but we are forbidden to believe in evolution of the soul. We're forbidden to believe that the immaterial emerges from the material. This teaching is called theistic evolution. Theism, God directing evolution. Theistic evolution. And it is supposedly a legitimate compromise between Genesis, the account of Genesis, and Darwinian naturalism. But, and I say this with respect, I believe that this was a great weakness in the pre-Vatican II era, and it provided the opportunity for someone as crafty as Father Teilhard de Chardin, who was the, quote, evolution priest, and other evolutionists to gain widespread favor. Now, it could be argued, though, that evolution was the great neutralizer that prevented Catholics from fighting what is actually a deadly infidel creed. All right? Because why should I take the trouble and why should I go through all the bother and energy to fight something that, if it admits a Catholic interpretation? Now, evolution, we talked about this in the previous program, has produced nothing but disastrous and irreligious fruits. As I pointed out, is the foundation of our entire atheistic modern world. We pointed out that communism is based on evolution, secular humanism based on evolution, and then all the bad fruits of secular humanism, abortion, widespread contraception, situation ethics, euthanasia, all based on secular humanism, based on evolution. If you take evolution away, all of that falls. This is the fruit of evolution and its product. Its evolution and its products. In a letter to a friend, Darwin himself called his theory the devil's gospel. So instead of fighting the devil's gospel, as I believe we should be doing, theistic evolution has us trying to find a home for it in Genesis. Now, what I see is the defects of evolution. Theistic evolution can be summed up in 2 points, okay? First, based on the evidence against evolution and the base also on the lack of proof of evolution, I think we can begin to argue that the days of theistic evolution are over. And secondly, according to strict papal teaching on the subject, especially when you see we're going to take in what the Church has said for centuries on this, it can be argued, I think, that theistic evolution was really never a realistic position to take in the first place. So, in the light, as I said, in the light of the massive evidence, or at least the evidence against evolution, or at least what we'll say the lack of evidence for evolution, especially since 1980 when the evolutionists themselves admitted that we don't have the fossil evidence we need, then if evolution is shown to be not true, then theistic evolution is rather pointless. It's like believing in theistic Dumbo, providing God made the ears, or believing in a theistic February 31st, provided you put it on the Christian calendar. Well, there's no February 31st, there's no Dumbo, so it doesn't pay to believe that God was involved in it. And I think that this is where we are with evolution. I think theistic evolution is what we'll call, in the terms of the post-conciliar church, an outdated theology. This is something I think that is outdated. Secondly, according to strict interpretation of papal teaching, I believe it can be argued that theistic evolution was really never a realistic position for Catholics in the first place. This section is going to be a little more theological, but I think it's going to be fairly easy to understand. Now, it's common to point to an encyclical by Pope Pius XII in 1950 called Humani Generis. And this encyclical is viewed as what I'll call the Magna Carta for allowing Catholics supposedly to believe and to teach theistic evolution. But, as I said, I believe this is a misreading and a misapplication of Pius's directives. Now, many churchmen interpret it this way, that it's an absolute green light to teach theistic evolution. And the clergymen who do this and the people who do this, I believe, they do so because they have become the honest victims of what Father Patrick O'Connell called, and I quote again, the intense propaganda inside the church for the theory of evolution over the past half century. Now, in this 50, you have to think about this too, this 50-year time span that Father O'Connell was talking about would have been roughly, say, from the time of Pius X and Benedict XV up until the time of the Second Vatican Council. And this is when the majority of our priests today, our bishops today, is the time when they were formed. Now, we have to remember too, I said there was a reason for the weakness, that during Pope Pius XII's day, the evolutionists had a total monopoly over science and education. They had all the money, all the media they needed. You may know that Father Teilhard de Chardin's expedition, the archaeological expedition that produced what turned out to be the fraudulent Peking man, it was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Well, that's terrific funding. They had the money they needed. And we tended to believe what scientists were telling us because of the great advances of science that were made in other areas. Because there is a difference between empirical science that you learn things through observation, direct observation like studying mosquitoes and what they do and how they mate and what they eat and where they fly. And then there's the more speculative science that you go from, you take a point of the present and you try and project in the past what might have happened. This is more a theorizing science, and you'll see, if you study it, that these theories change very quickly because there's nothing to really, you're not dealing with observation, you're dealing with theory. So, when Humani Generis was written, Piltdown Man, who we talked about in the previous program, he had yet to be proven a fraud, and he was a clumsy forgery, if you remember. And honest scientists had yet to organize any opposition against evolution. Up to that point, scientists were always fighting evolution as individuals. They would stand up, talk against it, and they'd be clobbered, they'd be laughed at, they'd be mocked. But in the 1960s, scientists actually started to organize and study together to present evidence against evolution or to show the flaws in evolution. But 1950, Humani Generis is written. It is at a time when evolution was riding high on a worldwide tidal wave, and even some of our best churchmen were intimidated by it. It seemed to be the science was telling us this really happened. Now, even though Humani Generis is referred to as the evolution encyclical, there are actually only 5 paragraphs in the document that deal with evolution. Paragraph 5, 6, 35, 36, and 37. Okay, but we're going to cover this quickly. And nowhere in there, when I read it, I don't see that a Catholic is allowed to actually believe or teach evolution. So what did he say? Well, paragraph 5 of Humani Generis explains that many scientists who teach that evolution is true, these people claim that it explains all things, and Pius points out that the communists are very pleased about this because it gives them the basis for their atheistic materialism. In the next paragraph, he says that evolution has paved the way for many erroneous philosophies, such as existentialism. We won't go into that for now. But he really gets more to the heart of the matter in paragraph 35. He says something very important. He tells us what then, this is a principle on which actually the Catholic faith operates, that when there is the case of an unproven scientific hypothesis that either directly or indirectly opposes Catholic doctrine, it is the hypothesis that must be rejected or at least questioned, and not the doctrine. You don't start by rejecting the doctrine. You start by rejecting the unproven hypothesis, which is exactly what evolution is. In the next paragraph, this is what we could call the theistic evolution paragraph. Here's what Pius says. I have to read this quote here. Pius says, "For these reasons, the teaching authority of the Church does not forbid," listen to what's being said here, "the teaching authority of the Church does not forbid that in conformity with the present state of human science and sacred theology, research and discussion on the part of men experienced in both fields may take place in regard to the doctrine of evolution, insofar as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existing or living matter. For the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God." Okay? So, what's been said here? Well, when I read it, I don't see where Pius XII gives a green light for theistic evolution to be preached from the pulpit or printed in the textbooks or believed by the faithful. What it says is that properly trained scholars in the realm of theology, in the realm of philosophy, in the realm of anthropology and biology, okay, they may discuss hypothetically the evolution of the body. But discussion of the evolution of the soul is completely out of the question. And Pius XII went on to stipulate that in these discussions, the facts against evolution, as well as whatever evidence there may be for evolution, must be presented. And that's what's missing even from many pre-Vatican II theology books that I find. The one thing the Vatican II could have updated legitimately. The pre-Vatican II theology books, a number of them, even by very good authors, they really don't give the evidence against. They seem to be collapsing under the intimidation of the evolutionists. So anyway, paragraph 37, in Humani Generis, in paragraph 37, this is a very important point. The Pope pronounced a no-compromise condemnation of polygenism. Okay, what is polygenism? Polygenism is the belief that man actually descended from many parents. Now, I was taught this in Catholic school. It says that Adam and Eve really didn't exist, but they are just a symbolic representation of a tribe or a group or an emerging race of monkey men. Now, Pius XII condemned polygenism as contrary to the doctrine of original sin And he taught that all Catholics must hold that all mankind is descendant from one set of parents, not a tribe. One set of parents, Adam and Eve. So then, let's take a look and see what we've looked at. If someone wanted to take what I believe to be an unjustified liberty and teach theistic evolution, and also be faithful to strict papal guidelines, this is the picture they would have to paint. To construct this hypothesis, it would have to be said that God created he directed a process of creation from hydrogen gas to amoebas, into jellyfish, into mammals, into monkeys. And then God picked one lucky ape and breathed a soul in him and named him Adam. And then it would follow, it seems, that God picks one lucky Mrs. Ape and breathes a soul into her and names her Eve, right? Well, the problem with that is we can't accept that either because of the seldom quoted truth that in 1909, the 1909 Biblical Commission under Pius XII ruled that Catholics must accept the literal formation of Eve from the body of the first man. And this statement carries great weight because 2 years prior to that, Pius XII ruled that the decisions of the Pontifical Biblical Commission are binding on conscience. They're not just disciplinary things. The literary formation of Eve from the body of the first man must be accepted by Catholics. So this is the picture then if we want to teach theistic evolution. Adam, emerging from millions of years of evolution, Adam's great-great-great-great-grandfather being a jellyfish, and Eve formed then directly, not through evolution, but formed directly from the body of the first man. Now, if we are faithful to the guidelines, this is the way we would have to accept theistic evolution. Would any reasonable person present this as a viable explanation of creation? It seems more to be, with respect, kind of an explanation from desperation. But Cardinal Ruffini, in fact, he said, if this is true, as the transformists are good enough to concede, that the body of woman was formed directly by God, and thus does not come by way of evolution, who will be persuaded that man's body, the virile sex, come from the brute beast? And he says this is an absurdity. It's an absurdity to accept this structure. Now, to wrap this up, people might say, well, the 1909 Biblical Commission, there's someone very highly placed in the church who speaks with a German accent, who says that we don't have to listen to the Pontifical Biblical Commission anymore, that these are kind of outdated. Well, even if you would want to accept that, and I don't think that's legitimate actually, because truth is truth, and Pius X did make it binding on conscience, but, and I don't see anywhere where they said you don't have to listen to this anymore, but in 1909, this is not just a decision, that Eve came from the body of the first, it's not just a decision that sprung up in 1909. This is part of the ordinary and universal magisterium of the church for centuries. It was taught by the fathers of the church. There's an exhaustive and comprehensive essay by a theologian named Father Brian Harrison, who writes very well. He writes very well on the topic of evolution, theologically and also scientifically, showing the problems with it, but mostly theologically. But he wrote an extensive paper on this, and I'm going to quote him. He argues that the formation by God of the first woman, Eve, from the side of the sleeping adult, Adam, by the year 1880, now this is before 1909, by the year 1880 had been proposed infallibly by the universal and ordinary magisterium of the Catholic Church as literally and historically true, and so that this must forever remain a doctrine to be held at least definitively by Catholics. Now, that's his statement. He's going to give you the evidence of this. The earliest known papal affirmation, now of course we have scripture, but the earliest known papal affirmation of Eve's historical formation from Adam's side, formation that is that of Pope Pelagius I, an encyclical from February 3rd, 1557, which was eventually promulgated as a profession of faith. In other words, Catholics will recite this as a profession of what we believe as Catholics, what we accept. In reference to the Last Judgment, here's what it says. This is a creed now, a profession of faith. I confess that all men from Adam onward who have been born and have died up to the end of the world will then rise again and stand before the judgment seat of God, together with Adam himself and his wife, who were not born of parents, but were created, one from the earth and the other from the side of man. Close quote. So this is a formal profession of faith from the successor of Peter, addressed to the universal church. Second, Ecumenical Council of Vienna, 1312. It published another solemn profession of faith. And here it takes up the canonizing the patristic themes, the fathers of the church, of the formation of Eve from Adam, as true history actually happened. A profession of faith from the Council of Vienna. We confess that after Jesus' spirit was already rendered up, his side suffered perforation by a lance, so that the ensuing flow of water and blood, the one and only Immaculate Virgin Mother Church, the spouse of Christ, might be formed, just as Eve, the spouse of the first man, was formed for him from his side as he slept. This happened so that the reality manifested in our last Adam, that is Christ, might correspond to a certain prefiguring of that reality constituted by the first and ancient Adam, who, according to the apostle, is the type of the one to come. That's from Romans. The type quote comes from Paul to the Romans. So we see then that the imagery of Adam, of Eve coming from the body of the first man, Adam, is a type, a prefigure of Christ, of the church, coming from the side of Christ, being born from the side of Christ, formed from the side of Christ at the time of the crucifixion. Okay, you take away evolution, or you take away Genesis, you take away that literal story, then that lance in Christ's side and the formation of the church from that loses all meaning. You take away Genesis, believe me, you can destroy practically everything. Then there's the dogmatic schema of Vatican Council I. It was in a schema that was proposed as an article of divine and Catholic faith. It was never promulgated, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because the political situation in the time of Vatican I, the council had to be brought to a close. Now, the theologians and the bishops of Vatican II were some of the greatest of the time. These were bishops and theologians who knew very well the entire ordinary magisterium of the church for centuries. And here is what they proposed as an article of divine and Catholic faith. Quote, "This our Holy Mother Church believes and teaches. When God was about to make man according to his image and likeness, in order that he might rule over the whole earth, he breathed into the soul formed from the slime of the earth the breath of life, that is, a soul produced from nothing. And blessing the first man and Eve his wife, who was formed by the divine power from his side, said, increase and multiply." So Vatican I, there was something ready to be released, promulgated as an article of divine Catholic faith, that man was created from the slime of the earth, directly the soul breathed into him by God, and Eve formed from the side of man. Then there is, and Father Harrison actually discovered this. No one dealing with evolution ever used this quote before, from what I could see. It is Leo XIII's encyclical on marriage. And in there, Leo XIII reiterates the truth that Eve is created from the side of Adam. We call it's the Arcana Divinae Sapientia, February 10th, 1880. We call to mind the facts, I'm quoting Leo now, we call to mind the facts well known to all and doubtful to no one. After he formed man from the slime of the earth on the sixth day of creation and breathed into his face the breath of life, God willed to give him a female companion whom he drew forth wondrously from the man's side as he slept. And bringing this about in his supreme providence, willed that this espoused couple should be the natural origin of man. In other words, he's still speaking here that from this pair, the human race should be propagated and preserved in every age, a succession of procreative acts which should never be interrupted. Close quote. So what's Leo XIII saying? He's saying, first of all, that this truth of the creation of Adam from the slime of the earth and Eve coming from the side of man is well known and doubtful to no one. That's also directive to us. This is something we should not doubt. Second, he says this is part of the church's permanent doctrine. And what is he saying that's is doubtful to no one and part of the church's permanent doctrine? The literal sense of Genesis and the creation of Adam and Eve is true. The Genesis account is true. So, the Pontifical Biblical Commission, when it said that Catholics must accept that Eve came from the side of man, was created directly, formed from the side of man, it's not just the 1909 Biblical Commission just speaking out of the hat and saying, well, we're just going to start teaching this for the first time. We could see that this has been part of the ordinary and universal magisterium from the centuries, and something that is part of the ordinary and universal magisterium from the centuries is what the Church has always looked at as an infallible teaching. Even though it's not proclaimed infallibly, it's considered infallible because it is a doctrine taught from the beginning, taught always, everywhere, and by everyone. So that closes our section on theistic evolution. Next class program we will ask the question and answer it, do animals have intelligence?